Hi, my name's Fred Mock. I'm the lead pastor of Quicksilver Church, and welcome to a video podcast episode of Listen, Ask, Tell, where I'm interviewing Werner Haag. And I want to explain a little bit about the purpose of this podcast. I've noticed over the past 3 to 5 years extreme polarization, not just on social media, though definitely including that, but also heard about and experienced in personal interaction among friends, among family, among church members. All kinds of disagreement, echo chambers, anger, frustration, alienation, different views of reality, and we are bombarded constantly by different messages. And so words in terms of speaking are cheap, but listening is expensive. And so what I want to do in this episode and in further episodes is talk about the importance of listening and how to equip each other to listen better, especially as Christians. And so I thought, what's one way to do that but to talk with someone who has a very different view of the nature of reality than Christians do, and someone who may have a different view of the origin of the universe than I do. And that's why I want to talk with Werner Haag today, and he's also my neighbor. And so it's great to have him. Let me just give you a brief bio about Werner. He did his undergrad at MIT in chemistry, and then got a PhD in environmental chemistry. He's got over 40 publications in scientific research journals, did postdoc research in Switzerland and at Stanford, journal articles for the EPA, National Science Foundation, and I think you've worked as a chemist for a number of years.
In industry now, in the last 30 years or so.
Yeah. He also coaches junior high and high school wrestling for the past 15 years. He enjoys trail running and ballroom dancing. And we've happened to throw the frisbee around a little bit when I saw him in the park. So thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, I was also on the national frisbee team, ultimate frisbee team in Switzerland. That was a lot of fun. And I also am on the board of directors of the Humanist Global Charity, where we fund global, charities all over in the world, mostly in Africa.
Yeah. So thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. Thanks a lot. It's good to see you again. And I appreciate this particular topic because I also, from my perspective, this is one of the major problems, the big disparities that we see. I mean, we used to know our neighbors and talk to our neighbors all the time, but as I'm sure going to mention, the social media is probably a big part of this, and we'll get to that.
Right.
In a little bit later. Yeah.
And I don't mind jumping in. What's your take on why social media is such a barrier to being able to listen well?
So the social media creates a few problems. One of them is the fact that we're not face to face, and so you say things to people. Not face to face that you wouldn't say to someone directly, right? It's much easier to be derogatory, and the face to face cues that we have are really important. And people have sort of maybe forgetting that. Give you an example. I was walking down the street or down the park the other day, and somebody approached me and said, "Oh, you hi to these nice people." I said, "Well, how you don't even know me. How do you know we're nice people?" He says, "Well, you're holding hands. I was holding hands with my girlfriend, right?" So there's just an example of how these interactions are just face to face is much better than just through these social media.
And you can get certain cues, like he's able to observe that you're holding hands, something that you wouldn't be able to demonstrate in social media or on a Zoom meeting, and then be able to comment on it.
Exactly. But then there's also just looking someone in the eyes and seeing whether they're tweaking their nose or something. If you add a comment you're making, and you get all these cues that someone is reacting one way or the other to what you're saying. And then there's other problems with the social media is that, of course, you can isolate yourself in a bubble.
Right.
And that happens all the time. And I mean, I notice that happening myself too. I hear somebody ranting about something different, and it's just, after a little while, it's annoying, and you just shut off.
Right.
And you'd much rather listen to what you're interested in, or that matches your style and your thought processes. And then another aspect of this is that there's been studies that show that fake news travels about 10 times faster and farther than real news.
Right.
I mean, fake news is often sensational, and it's just, real news is often boring. And that's just life. We got to adjust to boring stuff, because that's where we not at times need to be. But that's what makes it is harder. And then a third reason perhaps is just a generally faster pace in life. We don't have time, or we don't take the time, at least. When we're face to face, we may do this more. I mean, the podcast here is a great example of spending real time and doing some deep thinking about this. Right. But you get bombarded with 20, 30, 50 emails a day. You can't think about them all. Right. You answer, and people tend to answer in emails and in Facebook on snippets and one-liners, and they're never deeply thought out. I used to spend a lot of time trying to explain things on Facebook, and then someone would, I gave references, and then someone would come along and say, "Oh, that's all bunk." So they obviously didn't really read about it, think about it, or research it. So, and that's just the change of the way. Maybe that's one of the bad things about technology, that everything's faster, right? And we just have to cut down more than we used to. Right.
I want to drill down on something you said. I think in your second point about fake news traveling faster, and it's certainly you can have fake news that that confirms what you already believe, but I see it the opposite, where it's usually fake news that confirms what we already believe, but is against us. Right? It's a caricature of the view that we oppose, and that travels very quickly. Because one thing that social media is good at is polarizing, right? It forces you to take an extreme position, and so that I've definitely noticed that.
It goes both ways.
That's right.
I've seen it both ways.
That's right. That's right. But it forces you to choose a stance, and then think uncharitably about the opposing viewpoint.
Because they're good at getting at your gut, and this immediate reaction, like, okay, this guy has. Exaggerating immediately makes you have a gut reaction in whatever direction they're trying to pull you.
Right. And so speaking of disagreement, I think I said earlier we may have a different fundamental view of reality, but I think what I meant is we have a different view of the origin of reality, or the belief around a supreme being. And so I think one of the first questions I want to ask is, I know for myself I have an evolving definition of what it means to be a Christian. How do you define what it means to be an atheist?
So I guess we didn't mention in the beginning that I'm the president of the atheist community of San Jose.
Yes.
So I have very clear feelings on this. And
could I share a quick story?
Sure.
I think I saw you as a neighbor maybe in the past, but I think when I discovered that you were the president was volunteering at Second Harvest. We were both part of groups volunteering at Second Harvest. I think you were wearing the T-shirt Atheist Community of San Jose. So yes, this is the president.
So how did we realize that we were neighbors?
I don't know. I don't know how that part happened.
Did we just see you walking by?
I think so. Or maybe I saw you at the park at a later time.
Well, so the term atheist simply means that we don't believe in the supernatural, and that means gods or astrology or most of other forms of mysticism. But most atheists are also humanists, and by that we mean they're people helping people. That's the important thing in life, and caring for others in our present lives, and not relying on supernatural help or expecting an afterlife to sort of resolve everything.
Got it. So is it fair to assume that an atheist is also a materialist? And when I say materialist, I mean it owns only the material world that exists.
Yes, I guess the materialism, that concept. I just give a Zoom meeting on the history of atheism. I think that term started with the Greeks.
Okay.
So more or less, yes, we don't really believe in souls.
Okay.
As such. So the idea that when we die, our bodies die, and whatever had been us ceases to function, and we decay, and there's nothing really left, except in the memories of the people who have been with us. So humans are a very social animal, and so we really depend on each other a lot. And humans are the only ape that have whites in their eyes, and so we can tell where someone else is looking from where their eyes are moving, better than other apes and gorillas and such. And so that those human interaction and cues begin very, very early in life. And we project what someone else is thinking by what they're doing. And so even little babies try to direct attention to something they find interesting to their mothers or parents before they can speak. So these kind of human interactions are very important to us, and our whole social structure is built on this, on helping and cooperation, and that's how we've evolved to basically dominate the planet. And so when a person dies, we feel a big loss. And so that is just a naturally, biologically occurring thing, that they're dying and they don't exist anymore. But in us, we feel a major loss, because that's been such an important part of our experience. So that's, I think, where the sort of the concept of souls may come.
Yeah, that's a fascinating idea, because there are many ways in which every culture celebrates or holds death as important, and every culture has some traditions regarding that, and the idea of the soul is kind of integral to how people view death.
Right.
And
I mean, if there's an afterlife, you have to, your soul, obviously your body's not going there, but your soul's going there.
Right. And so I think what I hear you saying is, the idea of a soul is, it originated in part because of how devastating it mitigates the devastating impact of death.
Right.
Is that okay? Okay.
It's sort of it's that absence that's missing, that you assumed had been there or would be there for the rest of of your life, and now all of a sudden it's gone.
Right. And I would say certainly one of the things that I find compelling about Christianity is that it offers an explanation, a way to make sense of death, and that's a huge part of what my faith means.
Right. Yeah. It's understandable.
Yeah. So within Christian circles, we have what's called a testimony, or a story of conversion, and it's kind of like a narrative of how we came to faith. And we talk about that in various ways, like coming to know Jesus, making a decision to receive Christ. Right. And I think we've talked about this, we've discussed this, but how do you describe your, I don't know if conversion story is the right word, but your journey in identifying as an atheist?
Well, lots of people in the ACSJ, some of them have conversion stories because they were Christians or of some religious faith for a large part of their life. In my case, I grew up with a modicum of Christianity early on, but our family kind of just faded away from that when I was about 9 years old. Yeah. And we just found that, for the most part, we could live happy, good lives, productive lives, successful without religion. So there wasn't really a big moment of conversion for me, at least, like it was for some people. But there are a couple of examples of, if you want some examples of sort of testimonial examples, there's a few here. So I was a scientist in graduate school doing some lab experiments, and after doing a series of lab experiments, I began to understand the phenomenon that I was studying, this particular type of chemistry, and I felt I knew everything. And so I was getting late, and I wanted to go home, but there was this one more test that I needed to do, or I thought I should do, and I told myself, you don't really need to do this test because you already know the result. you're just trying to confirm everything, and you don't really need to do it. But I stuck with it, and I did the experiment, and lo and behold, the result was different than what I thought. Right? And this was an aha moment for me, because it showed me that I can make up all kinds of things in my brain that I'm fully convinced I know the answer to, and yet when I actually go to the physical real world, then it's different. And then I quickly understood what I had done, why this happened, but it just was really that aha moment.
Yeah.
So you really have to, you can make up lots of stories, and that's part of what's great about humans. I mean, we can imagine all kinds of things. We can imagine building a bridge across this bay, and then make it come to fruition.
Right.
And that's what makes us great engineers and great musicians and great artists, etc. That we can imagine all these things, but it doesn't necessarily translate to reality.
Right.
So that was an important thing. Another example was I tore my ACL in wrestling, and the doctor looked at it and he said, it's torn completely through. It will never heal without doing an operation to get a pig's tendon or something that they do these days, or take some from your ankle and heal it up. And I said, yeah, can I use it? And he says, yeah, you can go on, but you won't have much stability in your knee. And so I kept wrestling carefully, and started gradually getting some feeling back and being able to do more. But after a year, I decided, this just isn't working that well. So I'm going to go in and do the operation. So I went in, had the operation. He put me under, and I woke up, and the doctor said, well, I said, well, how did it go? He says, guess what? It healed by itself, automatically. Nothing happened, right? This was without prayer, okay, without any kind of prediction or anything. But the doctor said it would never heal by itself, and it did. So that was another moment that sort of said, oh, well, see. But I think really the more...
Wait, sorry. So you, when you say see...
Well, I mean, we hear lots of Christian stories about people faith healing.
Right.
And so people on stage, and then all of a sudden they can either walk or see or this kind of thing.
Right.
So, I mean, to be honest with you, a lot of those seem fraudulent to me. And
but
that's what your church is about.
Well, so you shared that example, and you shared two examples,
yes,
both of which it could have also be found in a Christian testimony.
Right.
The first example being a sign of humbling, we call that, or an experience of humility, where the what you thought you knew wasn't really accurate.
Right.
And certainly Christian testimonies have that element where God, we say God humbles us in some way, right? That's the meaning we assign to it. And then with the story of the healed knee, you could also assign meaning that God healed you, but you don't assign that meaning.
But I guess the concept is always that you pray for that help, or for this supposed miracle.
Right.
And I'm saying this all happened without that.
Got it.
Right.
Okay.
So.
So it defies the narrative in that sense.
It defies that particular narrative.
Got it.
Right.
Got it.
So I mean, I suppose a Christian could come along and said, "Well, God helping you in mysterious ways."
That's right. That's right.
But okay. But let me say that I guess the other thing that makes me an atheist is as a scientist, I've done lots of research proposal evaluation. So we have to give money to people, and I'm doing this for the EPA or the National Science Foundation, that sort of thing. And we have to very, very carefully analyze someone's proposal for what they're going to do with this money, hundreds of thousands of dollars if we give it to them. And we would just not even, if there's anything wrong with someone's thought process or then only about 5 or 10% of these proposals are accepted.
Okay.
And so it's very critical. So we couldn't possibly give money to something that is doing or expecting some kind of mystical approach, or there have been studies on whether mystical or supernatural effects are real, and they've mostly failed. And so we couldn't honestly, we're very critical of other scientists. Scientists are always arguing, and so we're always looking for the proper evidence, and someone will claim something, and then we'll reject that person freely, and there will be arguments in the peer-reviewed journals. But so that's part of me that wants to have clear evidence for everything that we see, the obvious evidence,
right,
or demonstrable, repeatable evidence. So,
right.
Now, I suppose the Christians will see. They'll see things that they consider evidence, and that I would not agree with.
Sure.
But I can understand where a Christian would also have evidence in the way they interpret things.
Right. Well, I think the struggle has been for me in this regard when it comes to how faith and science interact, is that most of the faith claims that I uphold are impossible to empirically validate. Yeah. And it took me a long time to get to that point to admit that, to acknowledge that. But it's I think that's true. However, there are certain, I don't want to call them realities, but principles, I guess, that can't be empirically validated, yet I ascribe to. I'm not sure. Again, there are probably some similarities where, like the fact of how devastating death is, and how much we desire to make meaning of it, that indicate to me, might point to something supernatural, to something greater than the material universe. At the same time, I recognize I could be just trying to mitigate, the devastation of death by, constructing something. So I'm able to hold both of those, to recognize I can have both of those viewpoints, but I choose I choose the non-materialist.
Well, you often hear the statement, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, and I'll address that in a positive way, I think, for your listeners, in that yes, there's a lot of faith. Even as a scientist, if someone's writing something, and I'm not an expert on that topic, but I know this person has a good name, then I will believe what he says, because we as humans cannot take the time to research everything. We have to take on faith a lot of things that we're taught and told. As a child, you take on faith what your parents tell you, and that continues on in adult life, just because you can't be, you have to make decisions on incomplete information all the time. Yes. And that's the way we survive. When we were, in the Neolithic era, the whole story goes, you hear this rustling in the grass. Is that a tiger or is it just the wind? Well, you have to make a decision based on, if you're not sure, you better get out of there. Yeah. But that's an extreme example. But you have faith that your car's going to start in the morning, that your son put gas in the car last time, so you don't have to go, and you don't have to understand how the engine works in order to drive the car. Right. So we make lots and lots of assumptions, and we have faith that our money works. Right. Right. In our legal system, and even laws. And so there's lots of things that require sort of judgments based on incomplete information, and if you want to call that faith, fine. So
Right.
it's perfectly logical what you're doing.
Well, there's different kinds of faith, right? There's those things are very relational, right? Meaning it's in the context of an ongoing relationship that someone, makes that kind of claim. And yes, absolutely, I view my Christian faith in a similar way, but I don't always get the two-way kind of interaction, at least that in the same way between me and God. And so there's some differences in how we think about it.
The daily stuff is more provable, more graspable. But I have faith that the theory of relativity works.
Right.
I don't understand it or anything, and I never had any connection to how that could be real until I learned that it helps, like our GPS program, that our GPSs were always off by several meters or a few meters until they incorporated relativistic effects in the transmission of the signal. And so there's an example of how relativity, but other than that, I don't understand it, but I just believe it because it's been told by people I believe are smarter than me.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I haven't heard. I have another friend who's an atheist that has talked to me about faith, and he doesn't talk about it in the same way that you've described it. And so I appreciate there's a broad way to think about it.
Sure.
So yeah. So one of the things that we talked about earlier was levels of polarization. You talked about social media and pace of life, and I think one of the things that I've observed in terms of like the dearth of listening or the death of listening today, and when it comes to face-to-face interaction, alluding to something you said earlier, is we rely on experts.
Yeah.
And so we take what someone says at face value, and then we trot out that person's opinion, but we haven't really thought it through for ourselves. Do you observe that? Is that something that you've also experienced? Is that a problem within the atheist community? Because I experience that quite often among Christians, where there are certain celebrities or experts, and that's true in the political realm also, and then people just regurgitate that person's viewpoint or employ jargon without really understanding what it means.
That's common in daily life, so I'll see that everywhere. Among the atheists, at least the people I interact with, there's a lot more critical thinking, I think, going on. So now there's a whole range of atheists too. So some of our atheists are just agnostics, and some of them are liberals, and some of them are conservative, and some are libertarians, and they just don't want to hear anything from anybody, whether it's God or the government. Just get out of my face, right? And so yeah, you'll get some of those people who just then will regurgitate whatever there is. Like you said, that's common. Yeah.
Okay.
I think so. I think it's a little bit less, at least. But the people I interact with, we have our discussion group. They're quite thoughtful and careful.
That's great.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the atheist community of San Jose and what some of the goals are of your organization?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So we're first of all a group that is just a bunch of friends socializing. So just like anybody else, I mean, social cohesion is one of the most important things in society, whether it be family or friends. And if you're going to ask me what's good about religion, I would say this is one of the top things, that it brings people together, and it brings them face to face, and it brings them talking to each other and doing things and having those social networks. And when someone's in trouble, there's someone there to back you up and help you out, whether it be family or friends. I personally feel like I get those connections. I have a strong family bond, and members of all these clubs or running clubs and atheist group and wrestling and everything. I got more groups of friends than I can handle, and so I get all that from that group. But if religion is your way of doing that, then by all means, that's ultimately very important. and that will keep your kids out of trouble after school. It'll keep them. It'll reduce the amount of crime and just bring people being more helpful to each other. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's to me a humanist ideal, and that those ideals can be had different ways, and religion is surely a good one.
Right.
For that. Yeah.
So given that, how important is it to, for lack of a better word, I'm going to use a Christian term, evangelize atheism?
Let me finish the previous question.
Yeah, sorry.
Was the atheist community
Yeah.
to say. So we really have four kind of things. One is just being that friendship, having that social network. The other is we want to sort of purvey a positive image for atheists, because atheists have been amongst the most hated groups in the country for a long time. And then because those, if someone is leaving religion, we provide sort of a refuge for that. Because the most difficult part of leaving religion is often leaving that whole social group that they were in,
right,
and being excommunicated from their family and such like that. So we provide that somewhere for them to go if they want that, if they choose that. Honestly, there hasn't been very many people like that, but occasionally that happens. Yeah. And then lastly, we do other philanthropic activities. We go bowling, but we also fund a medical clinic in Africa and provide water tanks and clean water and support their classrooms and orphanages. And we go to the food bank and do street cleanups and blood drives and things like that. So that's what we do with the atheist community.
Thank you.
Yeah, lots of dinners and discussions and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's how we met, right? Through the saw each other through the food bank volunteering, and you've let me know about some of the discussions you've had. So, yeah, that's great.
Right.
Yeah. So, proselytizing, is that something that's important as part of an atheist community?
No, not really. I wear my atheist T-shirt when I go running. And I have my atheist bumper sticker, and I just put a big A in my front yard.
Yeah.
But I'm the exception. People see that and they go, "Boy, you're brave," right? And so part of it is that religion has been dominant in society for so long, and atheists have been, suppressed, and in the 1600s they were burned at the stake, and so there's some fear of doing that. Then partly people just don't feel that it's necessary. And a lot of there's always sort of this question: what do I do if I'm going to Thanksgiving and there's other family members and they want to pray, or in some other group? What do you do? And do you also pray and join in, or do you not? And so you don't want to ruffle feathers too much. So it's not a big part of what people do. So you sort of generally just go along and try to not cause problems. Going out, we do sometimes have like a booth at a mall or an outdoor festival, and then let people come and ask questions if they want, and that way, if it's up to them to come and ask us rather than us going out and proselytizing. So,
got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that's helpful.
There is some aspect of joining groups like pro-choice groups and women's rights groups, and so there's a little bit there's some of that, yes.
Okay.
So if that's not really proselytizing atheism as much as that particular group's goals. Yeah.
Does it does being part of an atheist community, is that it seems like the Venn diagram overlaps with being more liberal or progressive? Is that
of course,
okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Most of our members are pretty liberal. Yes.
Okay. Got it.
But that we're definitely interested in meeting all kinds of people, and as Abe Lincoln said, the best way to defeat your enemy is to make him a friend.
Right.
And so to discuss with him and get comfortable and let people understand your point of view, and hopefully we'll have more conservatives who are also atheists.
Right.
So we have nothing against the conservative values as far as being conservative. It's a natural dichotomy to have liberals and conservatives. Some people want change and some people want to stay the same, and there's always that balance.
Right.
But yes, most of our members are more on the liberal side.
Do you think that's more a function, how much is a function of being an atheist, or the area we live in, being in the Bay Area?
Oh, no, I think it's a function of being atheist, yes.
Oh, okay.
Because, I mean, there are atheists all over the country, of course, and they tend to also be more liberal people in those areas.
Okay.
It's just that thought process is why? Haven't thought this one through exactly, but being more critically thinking, being more cosmopolitan, tends to as you visit a lot of other countries, you see lots of different ideas and different ways people are doing things, and then you realize, oh, what I was always taught was what I thought was fundamental and fixed is really not that fixed.
Yeah.
That you can do things in a lot of different ways, and therefore you're much more open to gays and alternate lifestyles and that sort of thing. So, and the people who tend to be more conservative are not everyone by all means, but tend to be more in the middle of the country, where there's less traveling. A lot of people haven't gone outside their state or even city, so they don't see lots of alternative cultures.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I'm not surprised by what you said, but I haven't thought about it at length either. So that was helpful. It was insightful.
This actually happened the first time I read during the Roman period, where around 300 the Hellenistic age, there as the Roman Empire and Alexander the Great and the Persian empires spread across, they integrated a lot of smaller cultures, and so there's a lot more mixing of ideas, and that led to more cosmopolitan and these philosophies like Stoicism and Epicureanism and skepticism that were mostly didn't believe in an afterlife. And just said, well, we as Epicureans, for example, said that we need to enjoy life here while we can. That doesn't mean being just wasteful or abusing other people. It just means doing the best we can here now, and so those kind of ideas are pretty old. Yeah,
I had no idea. Thank you. Yeah, I think given that might segue into our next question, as far as how you view religious people, and one of the things I asked in this question was I'm interested how you may have experienced this firsthand. I mean, I'm speaking that as almost kind of a confession, where, I know I haven't. I struggle at times to be able to listen well, and it's been quite a considerable amount of work and effort that I've had to exert to learn how to listen well. And so I would imagine you've had run-ins with religious people where you didn't experience them as listening very well. I'd love to hear what that was like.
Well, many people are poor listeners. Okay, it's natural to want to convince other people to be like yourself.
Right.
I mean, I'm going around all the time trying to convince girls and guys to join my wrestling team, because I think wrestling is the greatest sport there is, right?
Better than Ultimate.
Well, in certain ways, yes, yes. Because it's more all around. Anyway, I love it, and so I want other people to love it,
Yeah.
and so that's a natural thing. And whether it's religion or football or whatever you do, or playing the piano, people are always trying to convince you to be like them, and it's natural. We're, like I said, we're social beings. We want people to join our group.
Right.
Now, as a scientist, we're trained very hard to listen carefully and listen to someone's propositions before answering or criticizing. And so I feel like I have that experience a little bit better than the average person. I think that happens in atheist groups as well. That like it happens all across society.
Yeah.
I do, however, think that perhaps because, as you talk about proselytizing, that's sort of part of the training of religious people. And so when someone comes knocking on my door, they're not coming in with an open mind and say, hey, let's have a discussion about this. They're coming in with an agenda to try to teach me something or convince me of something.
Yes.
And so that's perhaps a little bit more than the average person. Religious people are trying to do that. Yeah.
Right.
But that kind of segues into the next question, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, can I make a comment? Make a comment about that. Absolutely. We train people. I'm part of. We train people to proselytize and be aggressive, and maybe if I could, maybe respond to that. And again, not to excuse it, but just to give some perspective. We believe we have the best news in the world, and we want to convince people of it. And so it reminds me of, I think it was the movie Don't Look Up, which I think was a parody about a meteor that was going to hit the Earth, and they're trying to go around and convince people that this is real, but people didn't believe them. But it's a little bit of that kind of experience where we're trying to convince people of an impending reality that's invisible, and that you need to respond to, right? And so we feel an urgency to be able to communicate it at the expense of often, being able to listen well. And so in my journey as a Christian, I've definitely received that training. I give that training today, and yet I also realize it's important to. There's a cliche way to say it, but to meet people where they're at, in terms of where they're coming from, in terms of hearing their perspective, in order to help them perhaps see what we're trying to convince them of. And so that's kind of how I think about it.
So whenever I give a lecture, I'm always at a school or something, you always kind of, or at other meeting, first ask who has experience in this field, or who's trained how, or what is the audience that you're listening that you have, and then you can adjust your talk to that level.
Yes.
And so I think that's what you're saying.
I ask that all the time. Yeah, I ask that all the time when I come into an audience, where they're coming from, because part of the communication work or effort is, what are the presuppositions someone has coming into the conversation? Because if you can't address the presupposition, it's a non-starter. You're not getting anywhere with that person. And so sometimes you can sense that sometimes from the very beginning, just in the first minute of the conversation, whether that someone has the presupposition. And that's true either way, religious or non-religious, any audience. Topic, any topic. But like you said, that is a great segue to the next one. What do you think it means to be a good listener? And I think you've given some indication of that as a scientist, being able to approach something objectively. And how do you practice it in your own life?
So the key here, I think, is to have an open mindset in the beginning, and always approach a new person with the mindset that, okay, what can I learn from this conversation? Even if you don't agree with the other person, let them state their position and their state of and what they're trying to tell you,
Right.
Rather than having this mindset of, well, what can I teach this person, or what can I? You can have that in the back of your mind, but start the conversation with, okay, how can I learn something from that? You can always learn something from everybody, even a little kids, sometimes.
Right.
So because everyone has different experiences and coming from different places, so that's really the main key. And the second approach is to make sort of open-ended questions instead of leading questions. If you lead them already in a certain direction,
right.
then you. So if you ask an open-ended question, you may get an answer you weren't even expecting. You may have something in particular in mind that you want to address, but they mention something completely different, and then now you have an aha moment. You open your mind. Oh, this is what they're thinking about it.
That's right. That's right.
So that's helpful, and that's helpful, especially even in teaching and little kids. If you're teaching them history or whatever it is, first ask an open-minded question, and then if they're sort of floundering and they don't know how to go, then you can sort of lead them in a certain direction.
Right. Right. But the second can only follow from the first. You would only ask an open-ended question if you're really interested in the other person and you want to learn from them. If you're not, then it's not going to lend itself to wanting to ask an open question.
Well, yes. In the context of this, in the context of teaching someone, it helps them, makes them think more. Right. Because if the question's open-ended, now they have to formulate the answer. But, if I ask someone, oh, how did you like the hike today? Then they can answer, oh, I loved all the trees, or I loved seeing the salamander.
Right.
And you can see what picks them out. But if you say to them, well, was it too rocky on the trail today?
Right.
Then already you're limiting what they don't have to formulate anything.
Right.
Right.
Right. Absolutely.
So, yeah.
And I think what's can be so challenging about being a good listener is that at the end of the day, it's not really a skill. I mean, you can know the skill of asking open-ended questions, but if you don't have a character or attitude of openness to another person, it doesn't matter. Yeah, the skill doesn't matter.
That's right. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. It's hard because, I'm often criticized, or I will sometimes have a discussion with someone, and then they'll start going into all this, and I'm so open that that they have the feeling that I don't know anything about the topic, right?
Yeah.
And so they'll start telling me all these little details that I know 100 times.
Right.
So maybe it can go overboard if you're not cautious.
But I appreciate that about you, because you have an openness when I'm talking about something that I feel like you're letting me teach you about something, but then I usually find out later you've either heard it before or are well acquainted with it. So I try to keep my answer short, and then you can comment comment that you know it already, right?
Well, right. That's good. You're learning, but even if I've heard this thing several times before, there's always a new twist to it, and so that's interesting.
Right.
I mean, I really appreciate that we can have this kind of conversation.
Absolutely.
With you, and it's fun. We can, even if we have different life outlooks, we can still be friends, and we can still have picnics together and all this stuff.
That's right.
The whole other side of my family that lives in Germany, they're all quite religious, and they're I mean, one of them's a pastor, and others are going to divinity school or something.
Wow.
Not all of them, but
right.
But a lot of
so
them.
is that difficult to navigate?
It hadn't been. I mean, they're such great people, absolutely wonderful people. So every time we go there, we're welcome with open arms, and they'll do anything for us. And the same thing when they come here. It's become a little bit more. I've become a little bolder in my atheism lately, and so I've gone through a phase of sort of it took me a while to sort of have the courage to talk about these things.
To initiate conversations.
Yes, especially with them. But I think I'm over that now. So yeah, it provides a little bit of problem, but not much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not much.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that boldness. I mean, that's something within Christian circles we really encourage people to have.
Yeah,
to be able to initiate conversations about God and talk about spiritual things. So, yeah.
I must say that in Europe, though, the religion is not as how should I say, polarizing as it is here in the U.S. I mean, the U.S. religions, the Southern Baptists and such, I'm not familiar with all the religions, but they're much more aggressive. In Europe, everything's sort of, it's much more tolerated, and you can be religious and it's low key, and it's not as, they're not as pushy in the religion as. So it is different. It's easier that way.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know much about how the European expressions of Christianity. So that's new for me. Yeah. I have a couple more questions.
Sure.
But you mentioned you might have a question or two for me.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And in the interest of dialogue, I'd love to do my best to answer any question you might have.
So let me see what I wrote a few down here. I guess my first question is, what does a Christian think? Well, did we discuss all the other topics? Yeah, we did. Yeah, okay. What does a Christian feel? What goes through your mind when you hear there's an atheist walking down the street, or you're meeting one?
Sure.
Or what happens in your brain?
Sure.
Or your heart?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I can tell you what went through my head. I mean, I can't speak for all Christians, but I can tell you what went through my head. For instance, but
try to tell me what happens with other people.
Right. And I can speculate, and I think you've already touched on some things. And so when I saw the group of you wearing the T-shirt, and I think I might have recognized you as a neighbor. I think my first thought was, I think I generally think of atheists as angry. I think of anger. Yeah. I think there's something, and I think that anger is typically associated with hurt. And so I think one of our first conversations, I asked you what percentage of the people who become atheists were formerly Christians or grew up in the church. Because in my experience or observation, or maybe it was just what I've read, it comes out of some kind of hurt inflicted by the church. Yeah. And that's where that hurt and anger and disappointment come from. And don't get me wrong, there's plenty of Christians who've also experienced hurt and are also angry at the church. And so within that greater set of people who've been hurt by the church, there's a subset of people who've decided that they want to completely eject from Christianity or reject Christianity and become atheists. And so that's part of my stereotype, is that there's some anger. Another thing that I think or feel.
What are the other people who are angry or hurt? Where does that come from?
I mean, people. The church is an institution.
Sure.
And so, and like many institutions throughout history, has some checkered past to it of abuse, right? And though the church has contributed incredible things to civilization, there's also been some things that are not so great. And so. When we talk about spiritual abuse, and there's been some high-profile scandals within American evangelical circles over the past 3 to 5 years, whether it's sexual infidelity or spiritual abuse, bullying, intimidation, manipulation, all these different types of scandals, people have experienced a lot of hurt because of that. And my observation is most Christians, especially during COVID, just stopped attending a church. So that was their way of rejecting the institution. Now, they still retain belief in God, but they reject the institution of the church. Does that make sense? So they're able to keep it separate. For me, as a pastor, I see those as very much intertwined, because like you said, the social cohesion of being a Christian is it's integral to the Christian faith. And so if you're disconnected from a local body of believers, what we call like a community of Christians, that's not really being a Christian. Jesus talks about his followers being known by the love they have for one another. And so I think that's a huge part of what it means to be a Christian. But getting back to your question, did I answer that first part? Okay. So I think I said anger. And then my stereotype of atheists is also that they're intelligent and educated, and good critical thinkers. And then, maybe less favorably, disagreeable and contrarian. They're willing to go against the tide. And that actually can go both ways, right? It's actually good to be contrarian when everything's urging towards conformist. But I also see that in terms of libertarians too, right? There probably is some overlap between libertarians and atheism, because it's like, I want to think my own way. Don't touch me. So there is I do have a little bit of a stereotype of radical individualism among atheists. Because of that disagreeable nature and the rejection of institutional authority. But I mean, the fact that you're part of an atheist community and the president definitely debunks that, counters that stereotype. And so I do have a stereotype of atheists being more male, because I associate, and then kind of disconnected along those lines, right? Because of that disagreeable.
Disconnected from society.
Exactly. Less social. More antisocial. More antisocial. And then part of my stereotype too is, and I think I thought this a little bit, is that being an atheist, and you disproved this based on what you're saying. Being an atheist is a negation. My stereotype is that atheism is a negation, meaning like it's a negation of God, right? It's the absence of a belief. It's not the presence of a belief. But your earlier answer was most atheists are humanists. So you're not just denying something, you're affirming humanity. And I think that's really important, because to me, a negation is not a... it's not a... That's not something to rally around, right? You don't rally around the absence of something, you rally around the presence of something, right? So a belief in humanity is something worth rallying around, and so that gives them a lot more richness.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in. But I've often said that part of the goal of the atheist community of San Jose is to make ourselves obsolete. So we don't want to be just there in order to negate, right? We want to. I would rather have all of these people being involved in their soccer clubs or their drama club or whatever it takes to build their own community.
Right.
We don't. So that's we don't want to be around that that negative thing. So,
And
part of the anger, I think, I'm not sure if the anger you're talking about spiritual abuse. Is that what you said, or are you talking about some of the physical abuses that?
No. I mean both. But I also mean anger in terms of you mentioned aggressiveness, right? And American evangelicalism, we tend to be pretty aggressive around proselytizing, around evangelism, around you can say modifying or hoping for certain behavioral outcomes. Like we want people to to live a certain way, and people can experience that in many ways. And sometimes the way that it can be coercive or interpreted that way. And so I think some of the anger comes from hurt around an experience of shame when some kind of behavioral standard wasn't met, for instance.
I'm not quite following where the anger comes in there. The aggressive, are the people who are aggressive that are angry, or?
Oh, it's the people that used to be Christians that are angry.
That are angry.
Yeah.
At what?
At the institution, at church leaders and the institution of the church. It's primarily church leaders.
I see.
Because they represent the institution.
Okay. Because the feeling I got from most of the people that end up in the atheist community are angry at being told that they're going to hell if they don't perform in a certain way, and having that constant sort of pressure on their lives, which when they release from religion, they feel this great relief not having, of being able to dress in a certain way or behave in a certain way and not have this fear of condemnation.
Right.
So that's where I see the sort of that anger coming in, because they feel that part of their life was sort of taken away from them in their childhood.
This is an innocence that was robbed.
Yeah, or right, and then or they're constantly feeling having to perform in that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm not surprised by that.
Mm.
But that's maybe different
Yeah,
from my
that's
stereotype.
different,
Right. That's different from my stereotype.
Yeah.
Mine is more personal.
Mm-hmm.
And personal in the sense of like it's usually some kind of unpleasant encounter they had with a church leader.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like yours is more systemic, meaning like this is just kind of the nature of the way the faith system operates.
Right.
Which I think is unfortunate, because I don't have that experience, but I can understand. I can certainly understand how.
See, I think you see that because those are the people you're familiar with, and you're not as familiar with the people who just grew up without religion.
That's right.
And they don't have that kind
That's
of
right.
anger.
I have a smaller
So,
data set.
Yeah, so that's where you get that stereotype from.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. And then I think you asked me how I feel in those situations, and I probably feel a little bit of fear because I again, I'm projecting the anger, right? So I feel a little fear because I'm not sure.
Apprehension.
Right. Apprehension about what it's like to interact, and especially if someone finds out I'm a pastor, then does it become an adversarial?
Yeah. It could.
Right.
There's a tendency. I mean, I feel that same fear when oh God, do I want to get into a conversation with this
That's
guy?
right. That's right. And then I think one thing that I used to feel, and I think I said this, right? I think, again, most Christians, especially who've been well trained, we definitely feel a pressure to proselytize, to share the gospel.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's bad at all, but it's certainly part of our training, right? And so that does affect the dynamic in any given like social setting. And we're going to feel that probably in a more pronounced way if someone says that they're an atheist, right? We're gonna feel like there's going to be opposite. I think we're going to expect some opposition, right? And then depending on the personality or training of that particular Christian, they may want to address that head on, like let's just start talking about Jesus from the get go, or for some Christians they just may want to run away, meaning like not approach that topic at all because they're scared of the confrontation.
Yeah. Or they may understand that it's probably not going to go anywhere.
Right.
And we'll do that too, because that's one reason we don't proselytize much, because it usually doesn't go very far. But unless you're friends and you can learn each other.
That's right.
Okay, so now that I've asked the open-ended question, I have now you gave a different answer than I was expecting. And I made an open-ended question. What I was really sort of driving at was, do you look at us and say, "Oh, those guys are immoral. They have no purpose in life.
Yeah.
They eat babies." Right? Is that what?
I saw that question. I was really hoping you'd ask me that, because I was really looking forward to answering it. So I'm super excited to talk about that. Yeah. I think there is certainly a stage of my Christian life where I believed that, where I saw atheists as immoral and evil, and so on and so forth, right? Yeah. And I think it took, and again, I think that's a little bit part of the training that we receive. Yeah, because I heard a church.
You can't be atheist. You can't be part of this church and be an atheist, right?
Well, I heard a celebrity pastor make this statement, and he said, if it weren't for Christ, he'd be a serial killer.
Really?
Yeah, he said, he made that kind of statement, and I just thought to myself,
really?
Well, I thought a lot of things, but I thought to myself, if that were true for me, if I hadn't met Jesus or become a Christian, I am 100% certain I would not be a serial killer. Right. It's such a straw man, silly argument, and so I read some Sam Harris. And he has a book called The Moral Landscape, and I've read some of his arguments, and I just realized morality and religion obviously are tied together, but they don't have to be. Right. They don't have to be tied together. Right. And so I have no problem extricating those from each other. But I think part of the training you receive as an evangelical or is that they're tied together. Religion and morality have to go together. And that's just not. I mean, certainly there's a basis for morality because of my faith, but that's not the only basis, right? I think it's a very strong basis, but it's not the exclusive basis. I think that's important. I would say this, and maybe this will play to your expectation. I would say this, and again, this may not fall under the morality category for you, but I do see one aspect of atheism, and certainly this is a huge temptation within Christianity. So I don't want to pretend this is a unique evil, but I see a lot of pride, arrogance. I see arrogance within the atheist position. Yeah. And again, that's probably more associated with the intelligence and the education of that community than it is with the nature of being an atheist. But I see a lot of intellectual pride. And when I say that, I mean like condescension. Like we're these backward, believing in some fable, that and rejecting science. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I get that. Okay. I'm not sure where to go with that. Of course, that condescension comes from the idea that the people wrote the Bibles long time ago, before there was modern science, and so do they really have a better outlook on life or morality than we do now? And, it gets into this whole thing of the wokeness of now they want to rename the Valley Medical Center at Bascom and take off the at Bascom because Bascom at one point had a slave or something like that. And so that just gets to be, so the point is the morality of earlier times is different than now.
Right.
So
anyway. there's certainly a religious conception of morality, right? That overlaps with with common morality, but there are certain unique elements also. And so when I talk about the intellectual pride or hubris or whatnot, and again, Christians are just as guilty of that. That's actually within the Bible, within the Christian belief system, a serious sin, a serious evil.
Which is
pride. Pride is a serious evil. Yeah. Because it represents an independent spirit. And that attitude of independence is goes against how God created us. That's part of our belief. And so where you might say, hey, you know what, that's what led us to all these different discoveries. That's part of the humanist, zeitgeist or spirit. We might say, well, that's also the Tower of Babel and this hubris that led to God scattering and making different languages. And so that's one moral dissonance. Some place where it's not morally congruent, where we don't see something that you might see as a gift, we might see as something evil. But I recognize it has both sides, right? Ambition and pride are very close together.
Sure. Yeah, and you certainly recognize that people who are Christians in general, you're going to have a little bit more belief that they're going to treat you nicely or be more humble. So we do have that I do have that sense, at least. But of course, all the atheists I know are very friendly, nice people too, and would never think of hurting anyone. And what our people say is, well, if you need God to avoid killing me, then by all means believe. By all means, keep your faith. Right? But of course, the humans treated each other with caring in a long time before.
Right.
Before these religious texts were written.
Right.
You know, I mean, there's evidence of Neanderthal in the fossil records that had growth
Right.
disabilities, and they died in an old age, so they could tell the age that they died at, and so they must have been a burden to society, and yet they were cared for and taken care of through adulthood
Right.
by the society. So there's a lot of sense of fairness, and even amongst animals there's that biological sense of fairness and in bonobos, and you know, they make pacts with each other, they help each other, they mourn their dead, and so there's even vampire bats. Half the vampire bats, or a certain number of them, don't get a blood meal every night, and so the ones that do, they will come back to the cave and share it, and so that they can help each other survive
altruistic.
that way. Yes, it's altruistic, and but it's mutual altruism.
Right.
You know,
Right.
you help me, I'll help you,
Right.
and so
It works for the collective benefit of that
that's
community.
community,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so it's naturally born into us to be
Right.
helpful. And there's always outliers, and there's always benefit. Now, and I do not subscribe to the feeling that a lot of people do, that if we could make everyone atheist, then all these problems would go away. You know, you know, everybody points to the, like you say, the problems within that. You know, some of the abuse. I'm sure that once society, if it were to become all atheist, there will be a similar fraction of humans creating problems and abusing people. It's not going to change that much.
Right. There are certain dynamics of human institutions that would afflict any institution.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So good.
Any other questions?
Sure. Here's some fun one. Here's a fun one. Well, all right. This is a tough one. Define God for me. Do you really believe there's a guy sitting up in the clouds up there, looking down on us?
Okay.
Or what's your vision of God?
Sure.
And I have a definition that I could give you that you might be okay with.
Yeah, so I think one, pretty common evangelical formulation is God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. Okay? And so if I were to unpack that and define that, what that means is God can be everywhere at once. That's omnipresence. So he doesn't inhabit a body, so he doesn't have a physical presence, so he's invisible, and he's able to be everywhere at once. So that's omnipresent. Omnipotent just means powerful. I mean, they say it means all powerful, but I think he's extremely powerful. And so he has the ability to influence and intervene in human affairs, and be involved with our lives, and also speak to us. And yet we also retain the ability to make choices. And so he can see an outcome ahead of time, and have some influence in that end and how it gets there. But we actually have a considerable degree of freedom in getting from point A to point Z. Right? There's a whole different ways, but the fact that we're going to get to Z has been ordained. Like God says, this is how it's going to get there. But how we get there can have a lot of freedom to it. That was omnipotent, omnipresent, and then omniscient, all-knowing. And that kind of went to the all-knowing part, where God knows much, are there things that God doesn't know? Well, while Jesus is on earth, there were certain things that he wasn't aware of. So God can limit his knowledge intentionally. God can place limits on himself. But when you asked the question, what do I imagine when I imagine God?
Yeah. I mean, you say he, but
yes.
That's just a generic.
Yeah, I probably view God as male.
as male?
Yeah, I view God as male.
Really? Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there are books like The Shack, which I really appreciate. It's a work of fiction, and it imagines the Trinity. God, three in one, three persons in one, as a white man, a black woman, and I think an Asian woman. I can't remember, but it was very creative. It was very imaginative, and I wouldn't say I have that kind of imagination, because I think I usually imagine him as male. I probably imagine, I guess, if I had imagined him as human, I mean, as a human being, but I don't imagine him as human. I don't really think of it as human. I think of either him as kind of like a Santa Claus figure. Again, I'm not proposing that that is accurate. You just when you ask me that question, I think of like a Santa Claus type figure, or I think of him, and I've had this kind of image for a while. I think of him. It's not Simba. It's Mufasa. Mufasa from The Lion King. I think of him as a lion. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Because it's a symbol of the lion is dominant, right? And so I think of a lion. Yeah, as an image.
Do you visualize him as an actual being, or I've heard of people saying, well, God exists in some other dimension that we don't really have access to.
Yeah.
And so that's why we can't find him when we take our spacecraft up into space or anywhere.
I don't think in those terms.
No.
Yeah, I don't think about finding God in any kind of physical sense, but I don't at the same time don't think about him being in another dimension.
But yet you're visualizing him as either an animal or human.
Right. But because God is, I mean, the Bible's full of metaphor.
Right.
Right. It's and there's a lot of agricultural images.
Okay.
And so I believe God speaks to us in images that we experience in the physical realm.
Okay.
That doesn't mean he is the same as those things.
Right.
It means that's how he chooses to manifest himself to us.
Okay. To make it understandable.
Exactly.
To us.
Exactly. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Can I ask you one more question?
I got
in closing?
one more fun
yeah.
and then you ask.
Okay.
Me.
Okay.
So what does God do when both teams on the football field ask for for victory?
Yes. Yes.
Or on the battlefield?
That's such a great question that I don't think I have a great answer for.
Okay.
I'll tell you what I want to think.
Okay.
I want to think that God does some very complicated calculations about who he wants to win.
Right.
And he certainly takes into consideration all the different prayers that are being prayed. Wow. But of course, at the end of the day, usually someone has to win, right? You can have ties, you can have all kinds of crazy things happen. And it may even be, like I talked about point A to Z, that outcome may be preordained. But the way that you, like the win or loss, may be preordained throughout all of eternity, let's say, right? Or predestined throughout all of eternity. But how you get there, right, is going to be extremely variable, right? Okay. And so, an interception or a star player gets hurt, you know what I mean? There's all kinds of permutations in getting to that final score or the win or loss that could be influenced by the individual prayers of the people.
I see.
Right? And so there's it could be very, very complicated or very intricate.
So that's why you have to play the game.
yeah.
Even though it's preordained.
Right, exactly. The way that you get there. Right. Because here's the thing, right? Let's say the team that you're praying for wins the game, but then you lose your star player. Is that really a win?
Yeah.
Right. So you know what I mean? And God can do that where you pray for something, but you don't get exactly what you get what you wanted, but then you know what I mean? Yeah. And then obviously there's times, in the way I see your ACL story, there can be times where you may not pray, but God can answer a hope or a desire that you have.
I see.
Right? Because God doesn't actually require us to pray in order for him to work.
Right.
He desires it because it's collaborative, right? He wants to have a collaborative relationship with us, but it doesn't require it because he can do what he wants, and he wants to heal. So that's how I see.
Napoleon had a different answer.
What's that? I have no idea.
Well, his answer was, God is usually on the side with the stronger artillery.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's why the Warriors won the NBA championship. Yeah, my last question was in regards to listening. Is there a question or a message you would want Christians to listen to?
Well, sure. As far as atheists go, really just the message that atheists. What did I write here? Atheists are. I need to.
Yeah.
I'm getting tired. So yeah, atheists do not hate Christians. They do not hate Christianity. We'd rather keep some of those ideas out of our classrooms, and when we're teaching science. There's a reason for separation of church and state. Let me not go into that. That's okay. So that's just the message. We're not hateful. We get this all the time. Why do atheists hate Christ or Christians? And we don't. We're perfectly happy to have everybody together in the culture. We may ridicule some of the ideas because we just think they're ridiculous, but we don't hate it. We just think, and there can be, if we have workable discussions, then we can work together,
right.
Obviously. And then the message that we're moral and happy and try to be friendly and cooperative. So we're not in fear of God, and we're not, we're just as ethical and moral as anybody else.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah.
This has been a pleasure.
Having it was fun. Yeah, it was fun. Yeah.
This is a great discussion.
Yeah.